Night leans in, like a careful librarian, shushing the world to a softer volume. A moth drifts through lamplight. Somewhere, water ticks inside a kettle, the way a clock might breathe. If you're listening in bed, settle the pillow under your cheek. If you're listening while you work, let your shoulders fall a fraction. We're about to walk into rooms the past kept locked, pyramids washed with starlight, courtyards where tiny shoes waited like questions, riverbanks glazed with dusk, map rooms smelling faintly of ink and patience. This is not a story told to shame the dead or flatter the living. It is an act of looking closely. We'll follow a thread the way whole societies have written their anxieties onto women's bodies, and then called the writing beautiful, holy, necessary. We'll step softly. We will not turn away. And we will not turn pain into spectacle. Education only. Context and critique only. Breathe with me once, slow in, slower out. Good. You'll hear drums in the distance, but also the small sounds that keep the world ordinary. A seamstress's scissors, a boy whistling off key, a garden gate deciding whether to squeak. In the high places, priests promise the sky will listen. In the low places, mothers promise their daughters that survival will make sense tomorrow. Between those promises, girls learn how to make a life out of narrow corridors. Some were offered to the weather and renamed devotion. Some were bound into an ideal of elegance that mistook suffering for refinement. Some were told to burn the ending of their own story onto a pyre and call it fidelity. Some were married to maps. But here's the other thread, stubborn, luminous, braided through everything, refusal and repair. A widow who stays. An aunt who says, "Not this child." A reformer who drafts a sentence so clean it outlives a century. A queen who keeps her verbs intact while pamphlets try to turn her into a picture. A neighborhood that trades gossip for guardianship. These are not miracles, they are carpentry. And carpentry builds futures. If a question follows you into this program, let it be small enough to fit in your pocket. What stories do we still tell that require someone else to disappear? Keep it there. We will take it out now and then, hold it up to the light, and put it away again when the hour grows late. Because this is also a sleep story, and sleep deserves gentleness. So, the lamp is low, the page is open, the air is cooperative. We begin not with answers, but with attention, the only honest starting place. Step carefully. The floor is history, and it creaks. The creak is useful. It tells us where the weight has been. Chapter 1. Night on the Pyramid, a breath held between worlds. The night is velvet, and it presses close, warm on the skin, fragrant with copal and the faint green bite of crushed leaves. A torch pops. A moth pencils a circle around the flame, swift as a thought. Somewhere in the darkness, you can hear water moving inside a clay jar, a soft, rhythmic echo, like a second heart. The city lies below the pyramid, in a lattice of roofs and lanes, a sleeping geometry. And above, so close, the breath in your chest feels like an offering. You can taste the stars. It would be easy, from a polite distance of centuries, to flatten this scene into caricature, masks, knives, stone. But that would miss the way belief feels from the inside. It isn't theatrical. It's practical. You light the fire because fire keeps jaguars away. You plant the seeds because hunger is louder than doubt. And if the sky has a hunger of its own, if the rains stall and the fields crack open and the maize silks wither into threads, the people look upward and ask a question so ancient it has worn grooves in human memory. What must we give back to make the world give again? Tonight, a girl stands with her hair braided tight against her scalp, the plait anchored with a sliver of bone that belonged to her grandmother's comb. Her mother smoothed oil into those dark strands at dusk, hands sure from a lifetime of turning raw things into sustenance. The oil smelled like roasted squash seeds. Even now, when the drums begin at the foot of the pyramid firm, unhurried, the sound of a hand on a hollowed log, she can feel that scent hovering behind her eyes. Smells do that. They are little keys to rooms you didn't know were locked. A priest steps forward. He speaks a language the girl has heard since before she knew what words were, the language of balances, sickles, of days that are names and names that are numbers. He doesn't describe terror. He doesn't need to. Tonight isn't about fear, not publicly. It's about duty and debt. Debt, such a modern-sounding term in a world of stone and bird feather, yet precisely right. Corn is a ledger. Water is a ledger. Even wind can be counted, if you're patient, by the way it moves through the bells hung from eaves. You and I, we want to save her. Our minds leap toward action, outrage, retrospective morality. But if we are going to learn anything useful here, we have to try something harder than rescue. We have to understand without excusing, to witness without turning away, to ask how a city that carved calendars with more accuracy than our first pocket watches could fasten salvation to a young body and call it necessary. There were droughts, real ones. There were times when the river pulled itself thin, and the fish showed pale bellies near the surface, and the sky became a lid. There were seasons when the elders looked at the horizon, and their faces went inward with old fear. You can almost hear the conversation in those seasons. We must do what the ancestors did. We must pay attention. We must pay. There are different kinds of prayers. One kind sounds like gratitude. Another sounds like bargaining. This is the bargaining kind. Notice the care embedded in the ritual, not mercy for the individual, but tenderness for the whole, for the idea of a city continuing. The torches are spaced evenly. The path up the steps was swept at sunset, little piles of dust carried away in woven baskets. Women crushed herbs, believed to sweeten breath, to please the gods. Men scrubbed the stone with water hauled from far below. Everyone prepared. Preparation is another form of belief. And yet, if you lower your head so you can listen, between the drum beats you can hear a smaller rhythm. Not the city's heart. The girl's. It stutters, steadies, stutters again. Something in her wants to step backward. Something else, trained by stories told at hearths and markets, wants to step forward. Most of us live right there, in the tiny space between those two impulses, for most of our lives. There are scholars who argue that communities craft such rituals when uncertainty threatens to eat the map. They'd point you to fields, to clouds, to the problem of timing. Plant too early and a late frost will bite. Plant too late, and the rains speed past like a caravan that refuses to stop. Rituals become timekeepers when clocks don't exist. And sacrifice, awful word, clean on the tongue, jagged in the mouth, becomes a promise the community believes it can keep when the sky might not. Let's break the fourth wall for a breath. If you are listening in the dark, waiting for sleep to loosen your hands, you might be asking, what does this have to do with me? I don't live on a pyramid. I don't chant at midnight. But modern lives have their own pyramids. We too ask people, often women, to give up bodies, time, safety, voices, and we rename those concessions as tradition or beauty or loyalty or love. The stage is smaller, the torches are electric. The script, often the same. Back on the steps, the priest lifts his hands. The chant swells, not like a storm but like a tide, predictable, memorized, wave after wave. The girl's braid is heavy against her neck. She can feel each twist, each crossing strand, as if the hair itself is counting. She remembers a story her aunt told her once about stars that are holes poked in a great cloak so the light beyond can look through and make sure people are still being brave. She wants to be seen as brave. Almost everyone does. It's a very human hunger. Below, in the dark weave of streets, a dog wakes, listens, and settles again. Somewhere, a grandmother's fingers move in sleep, as if still shelling beans. Somewhere else, a boy dreams of running so fast he becomes a streak of silver across the plaza. Life continues its ordinary errands, even as the extraordinary unfolds in public. That may be the strangest truth of all, how the cosmic and the domestic coexist, how a city can contain both a girl's last steady breath and a pot of stew thickening over a low fire. If rain comes tomorrow, who will say the ritual failed? If rain does not come, who will dare say it succeeded? We humans are careful with our interpretations. We backfill our certainty. And when an act is costly, when it takes courage or cruelty to complete, we are expert at insisting it was necessary. We are kinder to our own past choices than to other people's present ones. Perhaps this is why we must study scenes like this, so we can develop a different reflex: honest grief, honest naming, honest refusal to repeat the harm under a new banner. The drum slows. The torches gutter and steady again. Stars behave themselves as if they were not, in fact, burning. The priest lowers his hands. The air changes, something unnameable turns the corner. If you look very closely at the stone, you can see tiny sparkling flecks catching light like sand. That sparkle was here before the city. It will be here after. The girl's name, hard as a seed, soft as a petal, has been said many times tonight. In a better world, it would be said the way rain says itself on tin roofs: ordinary, abundant, without price. We step back from the edge. We do not look away, we widen our view. Because this is not the only altar where women's bodies have been petitioned for the common good. There are others so domestic you could mistake them for furniture, so gilded you could mistake them for honor. You and I will walk to those altars together. We'll be gentle. We'll keep the lights low. We'll set down each story the way you set down a bowl that's been in the family for 100 years. Carefully. With both hands. And before we leave the pyramid, one more small thing. Somewhere in the city, a child is learning to count by pressing beans into a line. 1, 2, 3, 4. She is an accountant of a future we can't see yet. She will grow into it. We have to grow into it with her. Chapter 2. The Logic of Blood: Why Civilizations Bargain with the Sky. Let's change altitude. The camera draws back until the pyramid becomes a toothpick in a sea of green, and the drumbeat dissolves into crickets. From up here, the pattern is easier to see. People tell themselves stories to make uncertainty livable. If the story requires candles, we find candles. If the story requires numbers, we invent numbers. If the story requires bodies, we make an inventory quietly, with many euphemisms. People often ask, with that faintly superior tone presentism encourages, how could they? As if we don't build our own altars out of more modern materials. So consider the shape of the logic rather than the costume. Drought is a crisis that resists negotiation. You can't bribe the sky. But you can construct rituals that feel like negotiation, and then you can knit your community to those rituals so tightly that participation itself becomes proof of loyalty. If the rains follow, the ritual worked. If they don't, the ritual worked for everything except weather, which is to say, it worked to keep people together in a terror that might otherwise scatter them. Notice something else. In many cultures, when the cosmos seemed to need proof, women were asked to provide it. Not always, not only but often enough to mark a pattern. Why? Perhaps because women's bodies already carried public meanings, purity, fertility, continuity. When a society needs to dramatize sacrifice, it frequently uses the bodies it has already designated as symbolic. If your value has been translated into metaphor, it is a short step from metaphor to instrument. You see it in how the language behaves. A girl offered to ensure rain becomes bride of the water. A widow becomes pure flame. Bound feet become lotuses. As if pain were a flower that could be trained to bloom. In each case, the rhetoric softens the edge of harm. In each case, the community points to the individual and says, what you are giving up returns to all of us in a better form. The logic is tidy. The ledger balances on paper. I want to sit with the ledger for a moment. Accounts require entries, something given, something received. In drought economies, the math is brutal. In honor economies, the math is invisible. Both can produce the same outcome, an individual treated as collateral for a collective anxiety. You can hear this even now, in tiny phrases, for the greater good, for the family, for tradition, for peace. Each is a door. Some open into warmth. Some open into rooms where the air gets thin. There is another layer we should not ignore, aesthetic hunger. Humans like order. We like symmetry. We like meanings arranged so they click into place. Rituals of sacrifice, rites of beauty, ceremonies of purity, these satisfy the part of the brain that wants the world to look finished. A city with a pyramid looks finished. A foot tucked into a tiny embroidered shoe looks finished. A pyre that ends a sentence with smoke looks finished. Finished things calm us. Living things untidy, open-ended, wandering unsettle us. So we trim. We bind. We burn. We rename the trimming as elegance, the binding as refinement, the burning as honor. Is that too harsh? You ask. Maybe. But if you have ever retouched a photograph until the person in it looked more like an idea than a human, you know the impulse. The question isn't whether we have the impulse. The question is how far we let it carry us, and at whose expense. Empathy changes the math. Imagine a village council that says, no more. Imagine a mother who says, not this daughter, not these feet. Imagine a priest who lifts his hands and blesses rain barrels instead of bodies. Those imaginations are not fantasies. They happened in many places at many times. Reforms are a kind of ritual, too, one that asks the community to rehearse a new story until it feels as natural as the old one. The old story, salvation is costly, and someone else will pay. The new story, salvation is collective, and everyone pays a little time, taxes, attention, tenderness. Let's make one more wide turn over the landscape. You can see terraced fields stepping down mountainsides like notes on a staff. You can see rivers dragging sunlight into long, glittering braids. You can also see houses thousands each, with its own small altars to luck, a ribbon tied to a beam, a stone set at the threshold, a grandmother's whisper to a pot just before it boils. This, too, is the human way, to scale our bargaining with the universe from pyramids to kitchens. The form changes. The longing doesn't. So when we move from sacrificial altars to other practices, foot binding, seishi, political marriages carry the pattern with you. Ask each time, what fear is being managed? What dream is being purchased? Who pays for the purchase, and who does the accounting? Then, when you notice the modern equivalents, and you'll have the right questions ready. Questions are small tools, but they can loosen very old bolts. For now, the night is thinning. The torches on the pyramid are blue at their cores. Dawn isn't an announcement, it's an adjustment, a soft rebalancing of dark and light. Somewhere a vendor is setting out tamales wrapped in leaves, steam lifting like a benediction. Life resumes its errands. It always does. But once you've seen a ritual for what it is, a story designed to keep the sky predictable, you cannot unsee the costs written in the margins. And that, quietly, is the beginning of reform. Chapter 3. The Rain's Daughters, Mothers, Maidens, and Mythic Debts. Stories ladder the world. Before a girl is ever led up a step, a story has climbed ahead of her, pointing the way. In one, the earth is a mother whose womb must be watered by human promise. In another, the rain is a lord who requires a bride. Myths do what they've always done. They put personalities on pressure systems, faces on forces, so that people can speak to them, beg them, argue with them. If you've ever talked to your car on a hill or cursed the printer like it had intentions, you're fluent in this grammar. In these myths, women are often metaphors, fields, vessels, gates, bridges. Metaphors are beautiful and dangerous. They make quick sense, but they can make cruel sense too, because once someone becomes a symbol, their actual self grows faint, as if seen through rain. Imagine being called Daughter of the Cloud, so insistently that your own name dissolves into weather. Imagine being praised as pure, so publicly that your private doubts feel like a scandal. Over time, a person can forget they are a person and join the cast of a story that was written before they were born. Mothers pass these myths to daughters with love. This complicates our blame. A mother who binds a child's feet may be protecting her from a market that rejects unbound girls. A mother who whispers purity to a widow may be trying to keep her alive in a town that sharpens gossip like knives. The transmission of myth isn't mostly malicious. It's logistical. What else do you hand a child except tools for the world as it is? We inherit the weather and the umbrella at once. There's a small courtyard in your imagination. Let's step in. There's a well, a tree, a line of laundry raising its flags in the breeze. A grandmother is telling a story to a girl who's picking leaves out of a basket. In the story, long ago, when the rains failed, a maiden walked to the edge of a lake and sang. The lake felt obliged, being person-like, and answered with clouds, The grandmother's voice is gentle. She is not advertising sacrifice. She is nursing a memory of relief, an old, plangent gratitude. If the story has sharp edges, they are wrapped in the cotton of survival. Language does a specific kind of mischief here. Listen for it. Purify, sanctify, refine, perfect, beautify. These are verbs that sound like polishing silver. But they often describe what happens to a person when the community wants to display a virtue on a human body. The result is a costume with no seams, a second skin you are told you were born wearing. The verbs can be blessings. They can also be instructions. And instructions, obeyed long enough, become reflexes. We are not immune. Our era crowns different brides and builds different pyres. We ask people to perform the myth of success, the myth of effortless beauty, the myth of total availability to work, the myth of having it all, which, if you tilt it in the light, looks a lot like doing it all. We are not binding feet, we say. We are empowering. Yet watch how often empowerment means endurance with a new name sewn into the collar. If this sounds bleak, hold on. There's a counter-tradition equally old, the misreading of myths for personal survival. A woman called Rain's Bride might decide that if she belongs to the rain, she belongs to everything the rain touches: the reeds, the ducks, the wet glimmer on the corn leaves, and in private she might cultivate a fierce authority in that belonging. A widow told she is finished might light a small lamp and teach other widows to read. There are poems traced by the tip of a hairpin onto rice paper and hidden under floorboards. There are friendships that function as republics. There is laughter always sudden, irreverent, under the nose of rule. And there are reformers who take the myths head on. They write counter-stories in which the earth does not demand bodies, but policies, in which a widow's burning would anger the ancestors, in which the rain sees none as bride and all as kin. The work isn't only legal, it is literary. Because when a narrative guides a culture, you don't only change laws, you change metaphors. You retire the ones that led to harm and promote the ones that lead to care. Tell better stories, and the world adjusts its posture. Not overnight, but it does. Let's end this chapter with a small, practical image. A girl stands at a doorway. Inside, a ceremony. Outside, a market morning ripe with ordinary life mangoes, clay whistles, dyed threads looped over a vendor's arm. She stands with one foot on the threshold, one foot in the dust, listening. The stories inside are so loud, their rhythm so old. The world outside is loud too, but with a different music. A woman haggling, a boy spinning like a top, a dog delighted by a dropped scrap. She inhales. She can choose neither, entirely few of us can, but she can learn to translate. She can carry one into the other, soften the edges on both, and build a narrow, sturdy path between them. That path has many names. One of them is future. Chapter 4: Silk, Bone, and the Smallest Shoes, the Invention of Beauty. The room is small and bright, gauze on the window, a bowl of warm water darkened with herbs, a spool of thread, a strip of cotton as long as a promise. On a low table, a pair of shoes sits like two questions embroidered, curved, impossibly petite. They gleam even in the shadow, like the inside of a seashell. At the door, a neighbor coughs politely, says nothing, continues on. Privacy and complicity travel the same corridors. Foot binding did not arrive as a monster. It arrived as a compliment. At court, a dancer's steps were praised as floating, cloud-like. Poets wrote metaphors, the grapes of her toes, the arch like a crescent moon, and those metaphors spread like ivy, charming and invasive. Somewhere in that twining of praise and envy, admiration became instruction. Instruction became expectation. Expectation became gate guarded, lucrative. A mother wants her daughter to pass through that gate. Love learns to speak the local language. Here, that language is smallness as elegance. Let us be careful. This practice lasted for centuries, across regions and classes that varied in custom. Motives were layered: status signaling, marriage eligibility, aesthetic taste, and the slippery, mortal desire to belong to the center of one's world. The procedure itself, the breaking, the shaping, the binding, need not be described here. The body deserves gentleness, even when history did not offer it. What matters for us is the theater around it, the herbs, the songs, the advice, the visitations from matchmakers, the meticulous care over shoes small enough to sit in a palm. If you listen to the words used by admirers in old texts, they favor distance. A bound foot is viewed from across a room, glimpsed as it moves behind a screen, imagined peeking from silk. Distance hides detail. Distance lets the eye indulge, without the mind tallying costs. Our era has not outgrown this trick. Meanwhile, up close, in the women's quarters, a different vocabulary circulates: quiet, could, how to bathe, how to massage, how to prepare for winter when the cold climbs into bones and refuses to leave. Mothers did this to daughters they adored. Daughters consented because consent, in a narrow circle, can look very much like love. Some refused and paid. Some negotiated a looser binding, a compromise sold later as moderation. Some donned the smallest shoes and wielded them like keys to rooms where their voices could carry rooms within houses ruled by men but managed by women with formidable, if invisible, power. The moral terrain is not flat. It never is. Still, the demands on the body were relentless. Stairs became mountains. Snow became a sentence. A fall could be a catastrophe. And yet, life did not cease around this constraint. It coiled itself more tightly. Women conducted economies from stools, supervised servants with eyes hawk-keen, painted, embroidered, wrote letters sly and strategic, turned gardens into salons of influence. Here is one of history's recurring ironies. Systems that restrict women often rely on women's ingenuity to function. The machine both confines and is powered by those it confines. Fashion is a fickle sovereign. Eventually, the same forces that enthroned tiny shoes dethroned them: trade, upheaval, reform, the slow reconfiguration of what counted as progress. Campaigns arose. Pamphlets circulated with arguments that feel familiar: public health, national vigor, modern identity, compassion. Laws shifted. Habits had to be coaxed. Anyone who has ever tried to change a family tradition knows the texture of that work: the awkward holiday where a new custom is performed stiffly but with hope, the aunt who clucks but stays to help, the child who asks, mid-ritual, "Why did you do it the other way before?" And an older face that goes quiet for a beat, deciding whether to answer with a story or a silence. Let's break the fourth wall, gently. You and I, have our own costumes of belonging. Some are benign, even lovely. Some pinch. The pinching ones often come with excellent rationales and beautiful packaging. The question to ask of any ideal is not, is it pretty? Or, is it traditional? But, what does it cost, and who is paying? If the answer hides a ledger of chronic pain, carried mostly by people with the least power to refuse, then the ideal is not beauty. It is a tariff. Even as reform took root, something fragile required protection, the dignity of those who had lived within the old story. It's too easy to perform virtue by shaming the past. A better ritual, more honest, more useful, looks like this. We name the harm, we honor those who bore it, and we change the rules without mocking the people who played the only game available to them. Change that humiliates cannot last. It breeds countermyths. So picture, at the end of this chapter, a different room in the same house. The window is open. The gauze lifts and settles, like breathing. On the table, a pair of new shoes, larger, sturdy, stitched with the same careful hand. A girl slips them on and stands. She is wobbly, not because she is weak, but because new balance always feels like risk. Her mother watches heart, a complicated instrument playing chords we don't have names for. Pride, grief, relief, a tremble of fear that the world will punish this new stride. The girl takes a step. Another. Outside, the courtyard stones are warm with sun. She crosses them. Her shadow lengthens like a standard being unfurled. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor notices, says nothing, thinks everything. And if you listen closely as she walks, you can hear the sound of the future learning a new rhythm. Heel, toe. Hail, do. Ordinary music. The kind that, once established, we forget was ever controversial. Which is how it should be. Not every victory needs a parade. Some deserve a pair of good shoes and a street that leads farther than anyone thought possible. Chapter 5. Fire at Dusk, the Widow on the Riverbank. Dusk folds itself along the river in long strips of bronze and blue, as if the water were wearing a sash for evening. Bells sound thin, silvery, carried from a temple courtyard where lamps are being coaxed awake. Smoke rises in tidy cursive, writing prayers into the soft air. Somewhere a child laughs and is hushed. Somewhere a vendor fastens the last knot on his cart. Life, relentless, does its errands. She stands near the steps, bangles gone, hair subdued into a braid that feels heavier than hair should feel. The day keeps touching her with small courtesies, the breeze cool on the wrist, the ground still warm underfoot, a leaf coming loose and spiraling down with unembarrassed grace. These courtesies make the expectation around her even stranger. The expectation has many uniforms. In some towns, it is spoken in hymns. In others, it is spoken in whispers that begin with, "Shouldn't she?" It arrives as blessing and ends as ultimatum. It calls itself honor and virtue and the proper shape of grief. It does not call itself violence. Violence never does. Look closely at the architecture of the pressure. You will find piety, yes, but threaded with property, land that cannot pass to a widow if she is not recognized as fully living, alliances that prefer her memory to her mouth, cousins whose interests are so practical, they come wrapped in incense. You will find the old fear that disorder is contagious, that a woman unmoored from marriage might erode the banks of a family like an unseasonal flood. You will find a sentimental grammar that praises purity while circumscribing a person into a symbol. You will find neighbors who believe sincerely that sorrow must be made visible to count. She looks at the river. It is not asking anything of her. Rivers do not ask. They receive, they carry, they return as mist and rain. Humans ask. Humans make ledgers of the air. The priest clears his throat, and the sound is ordinary, almost kind throat as instrument, ceremony as rehearsal for a world that needs reassuring. He speaks of joining, of fidelity beyond the last heartbeat, of flames as sanctifiers. The words have been polished by many mouths. They shine. Words often shine brightest when they have been used to cover something sharp. Let us break the fourth wall softly. If you are lying in the dark, if your own breathing has grown even, if sleep is beginning to thumb the edges of your thoughts, hold this for a moment. Some scripts claim to be eternal when they are merely old. Their age is not an argument, it is a habit. And habits, even ornate ones, can be changed. The widow's body has done many unfamous things, carried water, kept accounts in her head so the market could be met with exact coins, learned the temper of spices, the temperament of relatives, the moods of monsoon and sun. She has known laughter so sudden it popped like a seed in oil. She has known boredom, the large, honorable boredom that keeps households alive. The script that has assembled around her tonight does not include these chapters. It wants an ending that can be told at festivals, a neat knot of smoke tied to a lesson. There are women near her, faces lifted, eyes like small lamps, sisters, cousins, friends who know exactly how the line between counsel and coercion can move within a single sentence. Some of them have come to hold her hand in theirs, to fold her back into the living if she begins to move toward the fire. Some have come to watch, obedient to a version of duty that makes spectacle out of sorrow. Some are both at once. Humans are good at being many things at once. We will not step closer to the threshold where privacy ends and theater begins. The body deserves dignity, even when culture does not offer it. What we can do is listen for the counterpoint, the second melody that has been playing for years beneath this public song. Reformers writing, arguing, appealing, widows refusing, magistrates hesitating and sometimes forbidding, families quietly making other arrangements and calling them custom too. Even here, with dusk a shawl and smoke a pen, there is a different grammar available, one in which grief is not measured by injury but by tenderness, one in which a woman's life is not a footnote to a man's chapter, but a book with its own spine. The first star appears, then another. Lamps bloom along the ghat, little moons cupped in brass. A breeze lifts the hem of her sari and lets it fall again. That tiny privacy, the cloth touching skin, withdrawing, returning, reminds her she exists. She breathes. The breath goes out into the world and does what breath always does. It disappears into everyone else's, becoming one common weather. In that literal communion, there is a lesson older than any rite. We owe each other air, not ash. Chapter 6, The Long Night After, A Life the Script Forgot. Not every widow is pushed toward flame. Many are pushed toward a different kind of disappearance, the narrowing corridor of months and years lived as apology. An old aunt clears her throat when someone laughs too loudly near the widow. A nephew looks past her when property is tallied. Invitations arrive late or not at all, as if loneliness were the only respectable garment for a woman who has outlived a man. People mean well. people in force. Here's the house where the night after lasts for years. Dawn comes in like a careful guest, edges around the furniture. A tin cup rings softly under the pump. Rice rinsed, strained, set to boil, spices wake in a small pan. The aroma of ginger makes the kitchen bright in ways the window cannot. She keeps time by chores now, by the logic of cloth and grain. The world, indifferent to scripts, asks for competence and gets it. She gives more than is asked because dignity is a craft, and she has always been a craftswoman. In some regions there are symbols of widowhood, colors withheld, bangles removed, hair subdued as if the body must wear a sign that says, "I am less." The paradox is cruel. The same society that demanded she be a vessel of fidelity now demands she be evidence of grief. She is offered devotion as a diet. She is asked to nourish herself on memory. She learns where her name is welcome and where it is an inconvenience that makes menus complicated. But look how women in every century, in every geography, build rooms inside rooms. She knits a small economy out of her skills, mending that is finer than new cloth. A hand spices so steady that neighbors will slip coins into her palm with their bundles. She teaches a girl to read a ledger, a boy to soften his voice when speaking to a tired mother. She is a witness and a school. The more she teaches, the more visible she becomes again, not as a widow, but as a human whose competence refuses to vanish. There are conspiracies of kindness. A cousin who declares loudly at the market that the widow's pickles are the only ones worth the festival table. A grocer who slides a measure of lentils across the counter and says, "Settle up when it's convenient." Meaning, I will not let arithmetic insult you. A neighbor girl who comes to grind spices and stays to talk until grief becomes a thing with edges, not a fog with no door. Silence can be shelter or sentence. She experiments. Some days she lives inside the hush like a monastery. Other days she lets the hush crack and air rush in. When grief is respected rather than displayed, it changes shape. It stops auditioning for the crowd and starts conversing with the person. That conversation makes a different future quiet, solid, unremarkable in ways that save lives. A law can ban a ritual. A community must unlearn a habit. An individual must write a new calendar in which survival is not a scandal. You want a concrete moment? Take this one. She sits at the threshold and shells peas into a brass bowl. The sound is like rain beginning soft, many, insistent. A young niece arrives with arithmetic homework and drops to the floor cross-legged. Explain again how borrowing works, the child says, and the widow smiles, because she has been practicing new mathematics for a long time, borrowing light from morning to pay back night, borrowing courage from chores to pay back sorrow, borrowing the affection of a household to pay back a world that sometimes forgets to offer any. They do the sums together until the page shows its small, perfect solutions. Then they go inside to eat while the rice still holds its steam, and the first smell of mango is like summer breathing on their faces. Outside, the neighborhood remembers and forgets in alternating measures, as neighborhoods do. Inside, a person continues. The world does not end. It rarely does. It changes, refusing drama that would tidy it into something memorable. There is bravery in that refusal, as plain and vital as water. Chapter 7. The Turning Reformers, Laws, and the Slow Work of Pauv. No more. History's spotlight loves a singular moment, a decree read from a balcony, a judge's hammer, a date school children can memorize. Those moments matter. They name the turn. But the turning a present participle, a verb that doesn't resolve, is longer and more human. It begins in conversations where someone says, "But why?" And someone else says, "Because it has always been so," and a third voice, recklessly brave, says, "That is not an answer." Picture a printing press sputtering to life, the clack, the oil, the incremental miracle of letters arranging themselves into arguments. Picture pamphlets changing hands at tea stalls, words entering the bloodstream of debate like a tincture. Picture meetings in courtyards where candles tremble in their jars, and a reformer's voice scratches at the air, first unsure, then warmed by its own courage. Picture a widow standing at the back, veil low, listening with the concentration of a person measuring a bridge. Lawns and courts, temples and schools, the debate roams. Some argue scripture for mercy, some argue economics for modernity, some argue constitution for rights, some argue simply from the human body's right to remain unharmed, the most obvious argument, which always seems to need the most reminding. The opposition is old, articulate, and expert at speaking the language of fear. If this changes, what breaks? If this breaks, who are we? Identities are tender, even when their rights are harsh. Then a case, then a headline, then a law. The law is read aloud. Pen scratch. The new rule enters the ledger. But law is infrastructure, culture is traffic. The day after the decree, 1,000 families still wake inside old habits. That is where the second revolution lives, in kitchens, in the ways aunts rephrase advice, in the quiet courage of a father who says, "My daughter will remain with us," in the temple elder who blesses a widow's work rather than her absence, in the neighbor who refuses to look away when gossip rehearses a dangerous chorus. We must tell the story of reform without writing a fairy tale. There are stumbles. There are places where the law's ink is thin and power bleeds through. There are years when the statistician's chart improves while a particular lane does not. There are also years when a lane changes first and writes itself up the chart. Change is not a parade route, it is a footpath widened by use. Signals matter. When a leader states plainly, publicly, repeatedly, that women are not collateral, it rearranges the furniture of a room in which such sentences were once unsayable. When a teacher builds a curriculum that includes reformers' names alongside kings, a child's sense of possibility expands like lung. When artists make songs and plays where widows are not metaphors but protagonists, the audience inhales a different oxygen. The law prevents, culture persuades, art invites. Movements last when all three collaborate. Let us land this in one evening, ordinary enough to hide its importance. A committee meets in a district office, under a whirring fan. The windows are open to a night, studded with horns and distant televisions. On the table, steel tumblers of water beating in the heat, a plate of biscuits going soft, a stack of petitions with fingerprints like crescent moons. They are here to allocate support funds for widows and to organize a shelter for those pressed by family pressure. It is unromantic work forms, inspections, the persistent arithmetic of fairness. It is also revolutionary. Revolutions always need clerks. On another street, a drama troupe performs a new play. The audience sits on rough benches. A toddler sleeps across 2 laps. The night air is heavy with cumin and dust. In the final scene, the widow does not die. She steps down from a threat that has strutted on stage like a god and discovers, because the playwright has done the discipline of imagining it, that the world continues if she does. The curtain falls. The applause is careful at first, as if people are testing their palms against an unproven hope. Then it grows. After the play, women linger. The troupe eats lentils with their hands under a single bulb. A child repeats a line over and over until it becomes proverb. Somewhere a judge circles a date on a calendar for a case that will close a loophole. Somewhere a grandmother changes the way she tells a bedtime story so that the moral does not insult the child's future. Somewhere a young man hears himself laugh at a cruel joke and feels for the first time the ugliness of that sound, its oldness, its poverty. He stops. He will not always stop. But tonight he does. If you have ever changed a habit, you know how to honor that size of victory. The turning is not complete. It never is. There is no end screen, no trumpet. What there is, wonderfully, is drift, the slow, collective movement of a society toward a shore it finally admits it wanted all along. Laws will be revised, customs will retire, new problems will arrive, disguised as progress. But one statement, once impossible, will feel unremarkable in the best way. A woman's life is not a stage for other people's anxieties. Say it aloud. The air gets easier to breathe. Chapter 8. A Bride as Treaty, When Love Becomes a Border. Shift scenes. A high window, pale silk curtains, the chalky smell of maps. In the map room, two advisors move carved tokens across a painted table, mountains tamed into brown pleats, rivers disciplined into ropes of blue. A marriage is proposed with the serenity of strategy, this name attached to that name, this seal pressed to that ribbon, this daughter moved like weather, from one margin to another. Outside, in a different scale of life, a girl practices a new alphabet, the letters stubborn as small animals that refuse a leash. Diplomacy loves a metaphor. We will bind our houses with gold thread. We will bury the hatchet in a wedding chest. These phrases make it sound ceremonial, as if peace were a gown you could embroider. What they hide is the straightforward fact that two people, often strangers, often very young, have been nominated to become geography. Their bodies will be asked to produce evidence, an heir, ideally several, to prove that history's quarrels have learned to share a table. If the harvest is bad, if a general is restless, if a treaty ages like milk, the simplest thing is to point at the bride. A nation prefers a person to a complexity. Travel with her. The caravan lifts dust that tastes like coins. Her trunks hold everything that can be folded. Garments, letters, jars of sweets that will travel badly but were sent with such hope they must be carried. The trunks also hold a few treasures that do not fold, a lacquer box that smells like summer rain on stone, a fan that still remembers a grandmother's wrist, a small framed poem that a tutor recited until it settled into her as rhythm rather than words. The rest cannot be packed, the geography of childhood, the choreography of a house where you know exactly which step creaks. At the border, drums and garlands. At the new palace, a logic of corridors. She learns quickly which minister likes an audience, which favors a mystery, which lady's maid serves two queens at once, one official, one private, and should be thanked with caution. She learns names in a new language like stones in the mouth, heavy at first, then warm. When she writes to her mother, she describes gardens. Gardens are safe. Politics hide in gardens easily, but at least the etiquette for flowers is less treacherous than the etiquette for men. Does love arrive? Sometimes. Humans are expansive. We love within the boundaries handed to us. We find intimacy in narrow lanes. But even when affection grows, it grows inside a cage made of treaties and news. A war far away can cool a marriage near at hand. A rumor from a port can turn a queen's face into a headline. When alliances are tense, every gesture is a sentence in a language of which she is only partly a native. She must become a linguist of atmospheres. Watch the portraits painted of her. In the first, she is an emblem, pearls like moons, a gaze disciplined toward serenity. In a later one, a small mischief survives the corner of the mouth, something amused in the eyes as if she has learned to carry her own weather into the palace. When a child is born, the painter exaggerates the softness of the scene, as if to prove fertility. When a year passes without an heir, the painter finds angles, as if to invite blame. Art obediently follows anxiety. And yet, beneath the oil and anthem, the person continues. She finds women who will not treat her as freight, an older lady who remembers another border crossed decades ago and offers a map with fewer traps, a musician who can play the scale of homesickness, a maid whose laughter is unprofessional and, therefore, healing. She finds two trees in the gardens, one planted the year she was born, another planted the year she arrived, and she visits them to measure a different kind of progress. There is a conversation we need to have about consent. We are tempted to find fairy tales in which a princess falls in love with a prince, and diplomacy is simply the matchmaker of a destiny already written in the sky. Such stories are gentle, and their gentleness comforts. But comfort is not accuracy. Consent is not only a matter of yes or no, it is also a matter of who is allowed to imagine alternatives. When the only doors in a corridor lead to the same room, the act of choosing a door is not freedom. The script applauds. The audience admires. The person learns to endure applause as if it were wind, pervasive, impersonal, weather more than music. What, then, does resistance look like for someone whose day is scheduled to the minute and whose face is a public resource? Sometimes resistance is spectacular, the letter leaked, the speech given, the ally sworn in defiance. More often, it is disguised as decorum, advice delivered at precisely the moment when advice sounds like agreement, a diary kept not as confession but as archive, so that later readings will have an honest ledger to consult, a child taught to trust their own weather rather than the temperature of a room full of men. There are also failures. We should not tidy them away. Not every political marriage becomes friendship. Not every queen finds a parliament inside a garden. Some lives are shortened, thwarted, turned into cautionary tales told by people who forget that the caution is for the system, not the person. We honor them by naming the structure that squeezed, not the individual who could not make space where there was none. Let us end this chapter with a balcony at dusk. The map room's lights make squares on the courtyard stone. She steps out where the air is faintly cool, and some evening bird is insisting that its repertoire be respected. In the garden, lanterns start like small moons. On the far wall, the vines have made eloquent work of climbing. She stands with her hands on the rail, palms reading the stone's old temperature, and she considers a fact so simple it feels like treason. Peace that requires a person to disappear is only a truce with silence. She does not disappear. She goes inside to the next appointment, where the tea will be sweet, and the conversation will have switchbacks, and she will take the most honest path she can find, without derailing the carriage she is riding. Her steps make no sound on the polished floor. The future, which is always listening, adjusts itself by a hair. Chapter 9. The Silk Road Pawn, a princess on the edge of the steppe. Morning breaks like a slow drum roll across the steppe, first a hush, then a widening, then light like poured milk along the grasses. The caravan is already awake. Canvas sighs. Leather creaks. Horses make clouded breath in the cold and stamp their hooves as if punctuation were a bodily need. Somewhere, a kettle argues itself toward a boil, and the air fills with leaf tea and the faint sweetness of dried apricot. Peace smells like this sometimes, small comforts arranged with care. When she rides out, the earth seems wider than language. There are no walls, only horizon and wind, and the sensation that every direction is forward. In the lacquered box on her lap are tokens she's permitted to keep from the world she's leaving. A comb carved with peonies, a letter folded until the creases become a map, a pin that catches the sun like a summoned star. The rest she carries in memory: the layout of a courtyard at noon, the rhythm of footsteps along a familiar corridor, the exact timbre of her mother's "Be careful when it means I can't follow you from here." The treaty calls her gift, as if human affection were a currency that could be stamped and weighed. Courtiers prefer that noun. It flatters the transaction with elegance and hides the arithmetic. The arithmetic is simple: a marriage to soften borders, a womb expected to anchor peace, a young woman tasked with being a living synonym for our intentions are honorable. If snow falls late or a general rehearses ambition, a scapegoat is more convenient than a map. The city that receives her speaks a different grammar of power. Its palace has corridors that turn like thoughts, trying to avoid themselves. The floors are polished and treacherous, training her to walk as if the future were slippery. She learns quickly what any newcomer learns: the room inside the room, the real one, where words are revised by eyebrows and silence has dialects. Her tutor marks verbs on a slate: patient, precise, to promise, to reconcile, to betray. She repeats them until they no longer feel like stones in the mouth. She practices smiling in a new language. The muscles learn a different etiquette. We should talk about portraits. The first is a public letter in paint. See? She fits. Pearls like moons. Silk that behaves itself. A face positioned toward serenity. Later portraits are craftier. A painter loyal to his own eyes will find the residual weather, a corner smile that refuses to be symmetrical, a gaze with its own thesis. As seasons pass, the canvases tell a sub-history of adaptation. The way her wrists learn bracelets as if they were arguments. The way a child on her lap changes the equation in the viewer's mind from bride to institution. Art obeys politics, yes, but sometimes it leaks truth. There are pleasures here. The gardens are disciplined but generous. The apricot trees take their time and then exceed expectations. On a wall in the shaded walk, Ivy writes an untutored script she adopts as personal emblem: climb anyway. She observes that after storms, the air smells like iron, and the roses rehearse relief, that the kitchens run on gossip as well as spices, that the old nurse assigned to her rooms carries a grief she polishes like brass, and that sharing tea gentles both their stories. Even duty has pockets of kindness, and she learns where they are. Let's break the fourth wall softly. If you are lying in the dark, maybe measuring your own compromises, here is a consoling, complicated fact: love can grow in narrow places without endorsing the narrowness. She learns her husband's temper, and he learns her silence's many meanings. He can be considerate, fond, even tender. Human beings, after all, are rarely single notes. Yet affection cannot erase the preface of the marriage contract, that she was appointed geography before she was invited intimacy. Every court has a theater of blame. If grain is dear, she is extravagance. If rain fails, she is foreign luck. If a war ends badly, her presence is read backward as omen. The same faces that applauded her arrival now applaud their own suspicions. Pamphlets will perform moral math, in which outcomes caused by weather and men are tallied against a woman's accent. It is an old trick, and it works more often than dignity can bear. Still, she writes letters that sound like landscape, long lines, careful adjectives, no panic. She advises as if offering tea warm, measured, without calling attention to the way a cup steadies a hand. Some counsel takes. Some fails. She makes a practice of visiting 2 trees, one planted the year of her birth, another planted the year of her arrival. She keeps faith with what grows slowly. One evening, a comet trespasses the sky, white chalk, dragged by a god with second thoughts. The court interprets with a fervor that would be comic if it weren't consequential. She refuses the panic. She orders lanterns hung in the west garden and stands beneath them until the comet looks like a hairpin left out by a distracted deity. In that reframing is a survival tactic, reduce spectacle to scale. It is a small defiance, but small defiance is a language, and she is fluent. If you want a single sentence to carry from this chapter into your own rooms, take this: do not turn people into borders. They are not fences for your fear. They are not moats for your memory of wars. Give relationships back their proper nouns. The steppe keeps breathing. The caravan leaves dust in the air that takes an hour to decide where to settle. The treaty will last as long as men allow it. Her patience will last longer. Chapter 10. The Crown's Thorns, the Women History Used and Then Judged. A balcony. A fanfare like polished brass. A queen steps out, and the crowd exhales her name in a single syllable that means many things: mother, emblem, caution, entertainment. She is dressed in a compromise, fabric heavy enough to carry the weight of expectation, light enough to suggest she floats above it. Somewhere a man with ink-stained fingers sharpens a pen. Somewhere a pamphlet reheats an old rumor. Somewhere a caricaturist sketches a jawline into ideology. Public women are mirrors with obligations. The audience looks not for faces but for confirmations. Tell us we are stable. Tell us we are admirable. Tell us we are what we wish to be. If her smile errs to warmth, she is frivolous. If it errs to reserve, she is cold. If she bears a child, the nation possesses the child with a greed dressed as love. If she cannot, her body is recited by strangers as if it were a weather report. We pretend this is history. It is also today. The technologies have changed. The pamphlet is now a feed. The caricature a meme, but the choreography is durable. Watch how speed amplifies harm. A rumor becomes a trend, becomes a narrative, becomes a reputation, and the subject becomes an exhibit walking inside her own museum. The exhibit is expected to curate herself for the comfort of the crowd. There is, however, a backstage. Every public woman builds one. It is not a place of scandal, but of normal. Shoes come off. Jokes are told with trust. Lists are made, hand to hair, hair to pins, pins to tray. The tray is engraved with the name of a silversmith who had a daughter who learned mathematics in secret because someone told her numbers were inelegant for girls. Inelegant. The word still blushes with stupidity. On the tray, Alongside the pins sits a stack of notes, briefings, charities, names to memorize, griefs to acknowledge in a sentence that must not stumble. She reads. She underlines. She writes in the margins a discipline called refuse condensation, a private philosophy that insists the human be allowed to remain complex. At public events, she resists the interviewer's alchemy that turns a life into a brand. When she speaks, her sentences have verbs. Verbs insist on action, and action interrupts stereotype. Her advisors strain. The caricaturist pouts. A girl watching on a small screen sits up a little straighter, surprised to feel seen by a person who is supposed to be only emblem. But the thorns remain. Wealth can be read as vanity, modesty as manipulation. A charitable visit will be repackaged by opposing editors as performance. A failure to visit becomes proof of indifference. A sneeze becomes metaphor. It is wearying to be narrated while you are trying to be alive. How does she endure? With scale. She builds her attention like a garden with zones. The outer bed's ceremony, pageantry, public sorrow she tends with duty, and a gardener's pragmatic affection. The inner bed's friendships, reading, music, a fierce humor she guards like seed. She prunes the voices that speak only in verdicts. She waters the voices that argue in good faith. She learns the schedules of media storms the way sailors learn tides, not to command them, but to avoid drowning. There are days she fails. She tries to withdraw, and the world interprets sulk. She tries to explain, and the world interprets spin. On those days, she remembers the rule a mentor taught her long ago: you are not your headlines. She calls the friend who can make her laugh at a joke unfit for engraving, then visits a hospital ward where she is not symbol but comfort, and the air changes. Let's break the fourth wall, deliberately. Perhaps you're not a queen. Perhaps your crown is only a profile picture and a handful of people who think they know you. Still, the thorn is familiar, isn't it? The pressure to perform a simplified self for a watching group. Here is a counter-ritual you can borrow from her. Reclaim nouns. Instead of brand, say person. Instead of content, say story. Instead of optics, say care. Watch how language unspools a noose. If history is a chorus, her part becomes a line that will be misquoted for decades. But somewhere in a dusty archive, a diary keeps the original phrasing, the verbs intact, the humor unsanded. One day, a scholar will find it and write a book that complicates the cartoon. The world is slow to apologize. The apology won't arrive in time to matter to her. But it will matter to those watching now, who will see that complexity may be delayed but not indefinitely denied. Thorns never win against patience. Not forever. Chapter 11. The Witch, the Dowry, the Honor, Ordinary Houses, Extraordinary Harm. Not every cruelty builds a pyramid or wears a crown. Many are domesticated, trained to sit at the foot of the bed and wait for an invitation. The tools are small, a whisper that multiplies, a purse that opens or doesn't, a proverb polished by generations until it shines like truth and cuts like glass. If the great stages of the past asked for women's bodies in public, the more frequent stage is private: kitchens, courtyards, alleys, the back room at the end of a hallway where the air forgets to move. A pot boils over. A neighbor knocks. Someone says the midwife's herbs smell wrong. Someone else says the niece's laughter is too loud for a decent house. A dowry is negotiated, and suddenly the girl is no longer a person but a ledger with columns for furniture and jewelry and favors owed. Honor, an abstract noun, costumed as chivalry picks up a stick and learns people's names. The family shrinks itself until it fits inside a reputation. The reputation is guarded even when it bites. These stories are local, ordinary, scandalous in the most unimaginative way. They do not trend. They do not become museum exhibits. They bruise the air and keep moving. A woman loses the right to laughter, one small rule at a time. Don't sing in the evening. Don't go out on Tuesdays. Don't sit outside when the road is dusty. Each instruction sounds like care. The pile is a cage. But this is also where counter-magic is strongest. The same houses that enforce can shelter. Aunties run underground railways made of gossip. Don't marry there. The sun has a temper. Come to me if they say cruel things. I will sit at the veranda until their voices behave. A teacher keeps extra notebooks in a drawer for girls whose families think paper is wasted on them. A policewoman chooses not to be bored. A priest changes a sermon so that honor means the refusal to harm. Listen for the sound that marks the pivot, laughter that refuses to be mean. Communities re-educate themselves through humor that does not rely on cruelty. The boy who once laughed at a girl's skirt length learns to laugh at his own certainty. The uncle who policed everything from mango slices to morals becomes a story told with affectionate mockery by the very young, who will not inherit his anxieties. The domestic sphere is fluid. It can be trained for generosity with the same discipline once used for control. Let's make it concrete. A block of houses, afternoon light like honey, the smell of chilies waking in oil. A woman named Lila sells snacks from a window. She has an accountant's eyes and a diplomat's wrists. She refuses gossip that nominates a young neighbor for exile and instead nominates her for errands. Take this to the post. Count the change. Choose the best coriander. In this redistribution of trust, reputations are rebuilt without announcement. The honor that once patrolled becomes an invitation to show up for one another, to lend, to witness, to insist gently that a person's value is not an heirloom to be defended with suspicion, but a garden to be shared. Witchcraft accusations, dowry demands, purity tests, they share a habit. They outsource communal anxieties into a single controllable story, then ask a woman to live inside that story until she disappears. The antidote is not merely law, though law is essential, but plurality. More stories about who a woman can be, told until they sound normal. The day a neighborhood grows bored with policing and excited by competence, a miracle has occurred without trumpets. Break the fourth wall with me for one breath. Perhaps your lane has different names for these old scripts. Notice them. Refuse their auditions. Practice a small domestic courage. Defend someone's complexity while the kettle boils. Most revolutions begin that way, over tea, with a refusal to agree to an unkind premise. As evening comes, the block softens. Radios migrate from kitchen shelves to windowsills. Chutney cools. Someone sings an old song that traveled from a grandmother's village and learned to live in a new key. The children invent a game with rules that change every 5 minutes because power, in a republic, is negotiated with giggling. A girl walks home at dusk carrying cilantro and a book. Both sway, with the same promise. Chapter 12. The Unbinding: How the Future Learns from Pain Without Repeating It. Imagine a museum with no glass. You can touch everything. The tiny embroidered shoes are soft as rain on silk. The treaty scroll crackles like a polite fire when unrolled. The brass bangle is warm a minute after you lift it, keeping the heat of your palm like a compliment. A docent does not rehearse triumph or shame. She speaks in the tense that suits moral weather best, present continuous. We are learning. We are repairing. We are refusing. We are beginning again, again. We have walked past altars and pyres, through map rooms and courtyards, into kitchens where reputations bake and cool. We have seen how easily a society can translate its fear into a sentence that ends on a woman's body. We have also seen how stubbornly tenderness persists, how reformers keep lists when the world would prefer amnesia, how an auntie's refusal can be as legislative as a judge's decree when repeated across enough afternoons. What now? The answer is unfashionably practical. Change the verbs we use around women. Retire sacrifice as compliment. Promote choose, learn, rest, lead, refuse, repair. Make rituals where girls are celebrated for the muscles of their questions. Teach boys the architecture of gentleness as skill rather than ornament. Design economies that do not require someone else's pain for your prosperity to feel real. If that sounds like civics, that's because it is. Policy is a lullaby and an alarm. Write laws that say plainly what should have been obvious. Bodies are not collateral. Consent is not a synonym for endurance. Honor is not a leash. Fund the clerk's desk as eagerly as the podium most of the world gets built in forms and ledgers. Build shelters and hotlines and courts that move at the speed of harm rather than the pace of bureaucracy. Train teachers and nurses and saints and cynics. Embed no more into budgets. Culture is the chorus. Commission plays where widows live and thrive. Record songs where brides dictate the tune. Purchase paintings that refuse emblems when people are available. Hire editors who can tell the difference between public interest and public appetite. Laugh in ways that do not require casualties. Make festivals where heroes are not only warriors but caretakers, not only kings but clerks and cousins, and the neighbor who knocks at the right time. And in your private rooms, because most revolutions begin, there build counter-altars. On 1. Place objects that represent your refusal to turn people into metaphors. A running shoe for unbound movement, a pen for documented memory, a ladle for meals that include everyone, a bus ticket or a school ID, or a spare key to your door for someone who needs it at odd hours when the script gets loud again. Light a candle not because the universe demands it, but because gentleness likes to see what it's doing. Break the fourth wall one last time. If you are asleep, I hope your dreams are kind. If you are awake, let's make a small promise with the morning, to notice who is asked to pay for other people's comfort, and to interrupt that transaction with the simplest tools: questions, invitations, budgets, laughter, law. Not all at once. All the time. On our way out of the museum with no glass, we pass a visitor book. Write this in it: we remember, we repair, we refuse, we rejoice. Remember the girls led upstairs and the mothers weaving strength into impossible choices. Repair where you can, teach, pay, protect, listen. Refuse to confuse age with wisdom when the habit is unkind. Rejoice in the stubborn ordinary, the rice that doesn't stick, the decent manager, the cousin who apologizes and means it, the teenager who explains a pronoun carefully, the widow who opens a shop, the princess who writes her own margin notes, the queen who truly laughs backstage. Outside, the weather has made up its mind to be generous. There is a breeze. There is a shade tree performing its miracle of green. The street is the same and not the same. A girl crosses it in unremarkable shoes, and a future that will be decided mostly by her, mostly with others, mostly without altars. That is the work. That is the win. It will take generations, and a grocery list, and a court case, and a comedy night, and a stubborn, boring, blessed refusal to be impressed by harm in fancy clothes. We step into that future as if it were a room we were promised long ago. It fits. The lanterns are dimming. Cricket song has replaced the brass of ceremony. The streets that were loud with verdicts have returned to errands, a baker coaxing a last loaf from the oven, a child bargaining with bedtime, a neighbor tipping water along the roots of something that will be green by morning. We have visited altars and pyres, costume chests and council tables, kitchens where reputations are cooked and cooled. We have watched the old scripts, sacrifice dressed as salvation, beauty dressed as injury, loyalty dressed as disappearance take their bows. We have applauded nothing they demanded. We have honored those who survived them anyway. If there is a single lesson we can carry into the hallway light, it is plain enough to whisper, do not make people into metaphors when the person is still in the room. Give bodies back to their owners. Give choices back their range. Retire compliments that are just cages with silk on them. Replace them with verbs that build, learn, choose, rest, refuse, repair, lead. Policies matter, we have said so. Culture matters, we have sung so. But the smallest unit of change is still a human habit. Ask kinder questions. Notice who is paying the hidden tax in any arrangement that calls itself tradition. Trade jokes that bruise for jokes that breathe. Fund the clerk's desk as eagerly as the podium. Tell children true stories about reformers and the ordinary helpers who kept the light on. Let me break the fourth wall once more. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. You don't need to remember every name or date for this to work on you. It is enough to wake tomorrow slightly more allergic to harm dressed in finery, slightly more fluent in the language of care. That is how civilizations actually change, not by a trumpet at noon, but by 1,000 small refusals that are boring to broadcast and beautiful to live. Before we close the book, place one image on the shelf where you keep things you intend to honor. A girl walking across a courtyard in unremarkable shoes. Nothing hurts. No one is watching to judge. She is on an errand that belongs to her and to the people she loves. The future, which can be tender when invited, adjusts itself around that stride. The lantern goes out. The room remembers itself as dark. Breath in, breath out, like a tide that has learned to be kind. We end here, not with triumph, but with permission to rest, to begin again, to keep unbinding whatever the past tied too tightly. Sleep well. Tomorrow, quietly, we continue. To understand the misfortunes borne by women in antiquity, one must begin not with a single atrocity or spectacular rite, but with the ordinary. The everyday is where constraint becomes atmosphere, so familiar that it seems natural, so constant that it disappears into custom. In village courtyards and city alleys, in dim workshops and palace kitchens, the burdens that fell upon women were woven through labor, law, ritual, and women were woven through labor, law, ritual, and story. Misfortune here was rarely episodic. It was structural, embedded in the way kinship was organized, property moved, gods were imagined, and bodies were interpreted. Some women were queens, priestesses, merchants, or landowners. Some forged influence in households and courts. Some even bent rules to their favor. Yet the baseline was an architecture of unfreedom, asymmetries of authority, of mobility, of bodily risk, and of moral expectation that stretched from the cradle to the pyre. At birth, fortune already tilted the scales. In many ancient communities, a daughter's arrival could be met not only with joy but with apprehension. A girl represented labor and alliances, but also dowry costs, questions of inheritance, and fears of vulnerability to war and famine. In some cities of the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, infant exposure leaving unwanted newborns to die of the elements or be taken as slaves fell disproportionately on girls, a quiet arithmetic of gendered value. Even where girls were kept and cherished, they were from the outset folded into a logic of guardianship, father to husband to son. The title for this logic varied: patria potestas in Rome, paternal authority in Confucian households, the household head under Near Eastern law, but its consequence was consistent. A woman's legal personhood was often mediated by a male guardian, which limited her ability to speak in court, dispose of property, or travel independently. Education, the scaffold of future possibility, usually marked another early divide. In temple schools of Mesopotamia, in Greek gymnasia, in the scribal rooms of royal courts, literate culture often built itself around male networks. There were exceptions: priestesses trained for ritual roles, aristocratic girls taught to read household accounts, Egyptian women whose legal autonomy sometimes included property management, but the general pattern placed girls outside the formal institutions where law, history, and mathematics were taught. To be excluded from these worlds was to be excluded from the language in which power justified itself. Without those texts and numbers, even clever women had to rely on memory, negotiation, or informal influence. The misfortune here is subtle but decisive. Illiteracy does not destroy intelligence. It restricts its aperture, puts it to work in narrow channels, and then calls the result nature. Adolescence narrowed the corridor further. Marriage, typically earlier for women than for men, was less a romance than a strategy in exchange among families, sealed with bride wealth or dowry depending on region, and attended by rites announcing the transfer of a woman from one household to another. The vulnerability lies in the economics of this transfer. Where dowry systems prevailed, a girl's natal family sacralized her virtue to protect the capital flowing with her. Where bride wealth systems operated, fertility and labor were emphasized as the returns on a costly alliance. In both cases, the woman herself was the hinge upon which obligations and honor turned. This meant that her body, her sexual behavior, her reproductive capacity, her visible conformity became a site of surveillance by two families, each with interests to protect. Laws codified the asymmetry. In the law codes of the ancient Near East, penalties for adultery often hinged upon the status of the woman as a man's wife, not upon symmetrical wrongdoing by two partners. In classical Athens, a citizen woman's affair imperiled inheritance lines and civic purity, and so invited severe social and legal consequences. A man's extramarital activity was more easily absorbed by the social fabric. Rome's moral legislation would later harden these divisions with public rhetoric about female chastity as a civic good. Across the ancient world, honor clustered around women's virtue and men's responsibility to guard it. Produce a paradox. Women carried the heaviest penalties for a moral economy that defined them largely as risk. When misfortune did strike in the form of assault, coercion, or slander, reputational damage could be as devastating as the original harm, because it could poison a woman's prospects, isolate her from kinship protection, and even jeopardize her dowry. The household, which could be a place of affection and interdependence, was also a sphere of unremitting labor, grinding grain, hauling water, weaving textiles, tending children, fermenting beer, preserving food, and managing the ceaseless logistics of survival fell disproportionately to women. These were not merely chores, but the economy under a different name. Textile production alone, spinning and weaving, was civilization scaled down to a room. Energy, time, skill, and patience turned into currency for the household and sometimes for the market. Yet because the work was domestic, it was coded as natural rather than remunerated, a sleight of hand by which value vanished into duty. Even when women sold their products in markets or supplied large estates, the profit often flowed through male kin or patrons. The misfortune here is that the very tasks that kept cities alive were invisible to the institutions that handed out recognition. Motherhood, a role revered in poetry and stone inscriptions, hid another kind of peril. The risks of pregnancy and childbirth in antiquity were grave. Without antiseptic technique, modern obstetrics, or reliable pain management, childbirth carried a non-trivial risk of maternal mortality, and repeated pregnancies accumulated danger. Women were often expected to produce multiple children, both for labor and to offset high infant mortality. In patriarchal arrangements where a wife's status depended on bearing sons, the pressure to keep trying could be relentless, chaining the body to a cycle of hope and danger. If a child died, the woman's grief could be turned into stigma. Was she unlucky, impious, or otherwise at fault? Purgative medicines, herbal abortifacients, and barrier methods existed in some places and times, but knowledge was scattered, often secret, and sometimes condemned as sorcery. To control one's fertility without legal or medical support is to live perpetually at the edge of fear. Religious life, which might offer consolation or authority through priestly roles, could also introduce new obligations. Ideas of ritual purity, especially around menstruation and childbirth, placed limits on women's participation in public rites and sometimes mandated seclusion. In some ancient societies, head coverings, sequestered quarters, or gendered divisions of ritual space were defended as protective and honorable. They could also create a geography of absence, keeping women out of the theaters of public decision-making precisely when gods and kings were imagined to confer authority. Mythic narratives compounded the exclusion. From Pandora's curious jar to stories that cast women as temptresses or harbingers of disorder, cultural scripts taught audiences to associate female agency with cosmic mischief. These tales didn't merely entertain. They underwrote habits of suspicion, making it easier to treat limits on women as the wages of divine history. Philosophy and medicine, imagined as dispassionate pursuits, often joined the chorus. Theories of humors, heat and cold, speculations about wombs that wandered, treatises on female weakness and passivity all furnished a scientific texture to prejudice. When the mythical canon described women as cooler or more porous, the courtroom and household acquired new reasons to assign them fewer rights. The argument's elegance was part of its danger. It seemed rational. Meanwhile, the philosophical ideal of the citizen, articulated in some classical contexts as a male body trained in public speech and warfare, situated women as necessary yet non-public, guardians of order inside the oikos while men performed reason in the polis. The misfortune lies not only in the rule, but in the ring of truth it acquired by endless repetition. Violence made all of this more brittle. War, raiding, and political upheaval filled ancient markets with enslaved people. Enslaved women suffered a double subjugation. They were objects of labor and of sexual access, their children often inheriting the status of the mother. Concubinage, coerced unions, and the use of enslaved wet nurses after elite births turned the intimate work of care into an instrument of hierarchy. Even free women could be swept into the consequences of male conflict, captured as war booty, married to seal alliances, or used as pawns in succession crises. The law might protect some classes of women from certain harms, but displacement and captivity often stripped away even those fragile guarantees. Cosmetic and bodily norms exposed another register of harm. In some eras and places, pale complexions signaled elite status, prompting the use of powders or pastes that contained toxic substances like lead. Hairstyles, cosmetics, and dress codes were never merely aesthetic. They were badges of obedience to gendered expectations. To maintain beauty was not simply to attract admiration, it could be a condition for social survival, a way to guard a husband's honor, secure favorable marriages for children, or avoid gossip. The trap was that beauty standards were expensive, time-consuming, and sometimes physically dangerous. And as with the domestic economy, the effort behind appearance dissolved into the presumption that it sprang effortlessly from feminine nature. The legal landscape, while varied, often maintained a script of dependence. In parts of the ancient Near East, a woman's testimony carried less weight than a man's. In some Greek polis, a woman required a kurios, a guardian, to transact significant business. In Rome, the paternal power could extend chillingly far over dependence, including the right, at least in principle, to arrange marriages, control property, and manage offspring. There were notable exceptions that historians emphasize. In Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, women often executed contracts and brought suits in their own names. Dowry law in parts of the Mediterranean guarded a woman's property against a husband's creditors. In some Near Eastern cities, wise women and entrepreneurs appear in transactional texts. These examples matter because they demonstrate that patriarchy was not a monolith. It had seams. But exceptions highlight rather than erase the baseline if a woman's autonomy appears in the record because it was unusual enough to be recorded. That rarity is itself a measure of the ambient constraints. Misfortune also traveled along the gradient of class. Elite women might be sequestered from the public gaze, but within estates they could direct substantial resources, patronize cults, and arrange marriages. Common women might move more freely in streets and markets, but lacked protection against arbitrary treatment. Enslaved and bonded women fell at the end of every whip without property, susceptible to sale, and exposed to exploitation. The same patriarchy that positioned free, elite women as bearers of family honor made enslaved women the expendable substrate of household comfort. One might say that the misfortunes of women in antiquity were distributed unequally. The higher one climbed, more gilded the cage. The lower one fell. The more the bars disappeared entirely, replaced by exposure. Yet to leave the story at oppression alone would be to miss the small, stubborn forms of agency that women carved out of constraint. Markets ran on the labor of women, who bartered surplus cloth and food. Households balanced because women tallied debts and favors. Sacred spaces were tended by priestesses, whose voices mattered in the quiet around altars. Midwives held life and death in their hands, and accumulated authority whispered from mother to daughter. Gossip networks, the social media of the ancient street, could protect a woman against a predatory man or ruin one who flouted norms, and skillful navigation of reputation could translate into real leverage. In litigation, a shrewd woman might rally kin, assemble witnesses, and maneuver a favorable settlement. These acts do not erase misfortune. They are the ways people survive it. Agency in such a landscape is not the freedom to do anything. It is the craft of doing something in a narrowing corridor. The moral charge of ancient misfortune intensifies when we remember how it was justified. Nature is a powerful word in old books. It is invoked to explain why men rule and women obey, why women must be confined for their safety or society's, why wounds inflicted at home should remain private. When customs that cause suffering present themselves as natural, they become immune to critique. They are no longer rules one could change, but facts one must accept. Religion, medicine, and philosophy, three great engines of meaning, were often deployed to sanctify constraints. To resist them required courage and cunning. To teach daughters to resist required even more. That such resistance sometimes succeeded is a testament not to the generosity of patriarchy, but to the relentless intelligence of those who lived under it. What then does it mean to analyze the misfortunes of ancient women responsibly? It means resisting both flattening and romanticizing. Flattening treats ancient women as a single subject, ignoring difference in time, place, class, and status. Romanticizing cherry-picks the exceptional queen or philosopher to obscure the millions whose names we will never know. Responsible analysis instead looks for patterns and their mechanisms, rules of inheritance that migrate across cultures, metaphors that blame women's bodies for men's anxieties, institutions that allocate authority while masking dependency on female labor. It looks as well for cracks in the edifice, legal reforms that protect dowry, cults where women officiate, cities where widows manage estates, poets who grant women eloquent voices. To map both is to understand the system, not to excuse it. Funnily, the hardest truth, misfortune, in the historical sense, rarely arrives as catastrophe alone. It arrives as normalcy. The women who shouldered water, who stitched linen in poor light, who calculated how to stretch grain through a lean winter, who mourned infants, who navigated in laws, who endured unwanted touch under the protection of silence, most of them did not think themselves tragic heroines. They thought themselves alive, and they were. The tragedy is not that they existed under constraint, all humans do. The tragedy is that their constraints were so often rationalized as love for your protection, as honor for your family's name, as law for the city's order, as theology for the God's will, or as science for your nature, until the invisible felt inevitable. To pay attention to ancient women's misfortunes is not to deny their humor, ambition, creativity, and strength. It is to take those qualities seriously enough to ask why they were required so constantly, just to secure ordinary goods, safety, voice, companionship, rest. When we trace the threads of asymmetry from cradle to contract, from myth to marketplace, we see a tapestry that is not merely of the past. The ancient world bequeathed to later ages more than art and laws. It handed down a repertoire of explanations for why burdens should fall where they do. Many have been unlearned. Many persist in subtler forms. It is precisely because the misfortunes of ancient women were woven into the ordinary that remembering them now can unsettle our ordinary, forcing us to ask which constraints we still call nature, and who pays the price for our certainty.